everyone, welcome back. I'm Professor Hall, and we are continuing our discussion about the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass. So if you watched the first two videos, in the first video I did an overview of the story, a short summary, and then the second video I talked a lot about slave narratives and what those were and how this book falls in with that tradition. One of the things that I didn't mention in that video is that this book also, at least part of it, falls into another tradition of writing called a literacy narrative. And a literacy narrative is a story of a person's relationship with language. Not just talking about memories of language, but also the difficulties of reading and the triumphs of reading and writing, and sometimes even speaking a language. So sometimes literacy narratives can be someone who is speaking a second language. A few of them are from people who were deaf. Helen Keller's narrative talks a lot about Helen Keller was born both deaf and blind, so she talks about how she acquired language and how she learned words. Her first word that she remembered before she lost her hearing and her sight was water, and how once she learned that word, how that unlocked other things for her. Malcolm X's book, which I should have linked in your read-alikes and I forgot, but Malcolm X wrote about how he learned how to read in prison, and he has this amazing literacy narrative about reading the dictionary and learning words, and if I'm not mistaken, once he got to the end, he started over again to really fully have a command of the language. So that's something that I'd like you to watch for. How are the slaves kept illiterate so that they are more easily controlled? How is Frederick at first allowed to learn how to read? How is that taken away from him? And how does he fight that? Because he fights really hard to learn how to read and write. And the ways that he goes about this are amazing. And then once he is able to read, he finds some anti-slavery literature, which again, the idea that once you can read, all of the doors that opens up to you, the new ideas of thought. So in some ways, they were right that learning to read would make him less easily controlled, because certainly once he has that knowledge, he's going to start wanting to apply it. And it's a big part of why he tries to become free and why he runs away from slavery. So then we come to that driving question of our class. We talked before about that pendulum swing between different literary movements of the past and literary movements of the future, and where our writers fit. And Frederick Douglass's book, to me, is always really fascinating from this point of view, and I may have kind of hinted at it in the other lectures, but we've looked at a couple of books that deal with sensitive issues, right? And issues of race relations with Hope Leslie, and we talked about how she used sentimentality and romance to draw you into the story and kind of make people sympathetic toward Native Americans. We also looked at those same techniques being used in our last book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, and here you would think that this book would use a lot of sentimentality. I don't think that it does. I think that he still uses pathos, meaning that he is here presenting the argument. If you remember from English 123 from college composition, when you present an argument, you can use ethos, which is ethics, pathos, which is emotion, and logos, which is logic, right? Those are the three pillars of argument that Aristotle talked about. So really, in this book, he is in different ways using all three of those pillars of argument to make the argument that slaves should be free, so for abolition, but going further than Harriet Beecher Stowe, who kind of, we talked about, still portrayed slaves as being very childlike and still had some racial bias of her own, to say that slaves can be just as good, if not better, than many white men, especially the people who are owning them, and that therefore we should have equality, which is not quite the case in Uncle Tom's Cabin, I don't think. So he does use pathos. He is trying to pull at people's emotions, and he's doing this in a couple of different ways. The first way is by describing the scenes of things that he has been through. I read for you that passage of him being in the cold with just a thin linen shirt. His feet are cracked, and so much so that he could put like a pencil or a pen in between the cracks of his feet. Those are very, very strongly emotional passages, but are they in that romantic, sentimental tradition? Not really, I don't think, because the Romantics are writing about faraway places. If you remember Hope Leslie, it's these imaginative scenes, and there's a lot of imagery having to do with nature, and they're trying to rev up your emotions, right? That's not really what he's doing. What he's doing is actually in some ways closer to the next literary movement that comes after this class is done, for the most part, which is realism. And realism was a literary movement where people wanted to describe everyday life in various parts of the country. And sometimes people think that those books are boring. Not the ones I pick for American Lit 2, just as an FYI, as we move toward that date. But some of the things that I would like you to think about as you're reading, or if you've already finished and you're watching this after, how does he try to, in some places he's using emotion, but in other places he's just trying to tell exactly what happened. So he's almost reporting in that way. First this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. So in that way, the book is different, obviously, than the fiction that we've read, and that this nonfiction, he's trying to display for the reader, here's what slavery actually looks like in this time, in this place. Here's the reality of it. In some cases, he has an owner who is a little bit kinder. In other cases, he does not. And he's not exaggerating those people like the romantic or the sentimentalist writers would do. He's not exaggerating their traits to try to pull you in that way. He's pulling you in just really in a few places by giving some description that make the reader emotional and make the reader feel sympathy. The other two pillars of argument, ethos. This is an ethical argument, flat out. Slavery should be abolished. People of color should be treated equally. That is the argument. So it is definitely one of ethics. And in certain places, he will talk about people's ethics, how they are using religion in a twisted way to try to uphold this institution, and the hypocrisy of that, how these are supposedly great men, like his first master, who was, we talked about, a senator and involved in the government, and yet also having sex with slaves to increase his property, or at least allowing the people who worked for him to do that, right? Again, that ethical argument. He's also arguing that the institution of slavery hurts people's spirituality, so that it is not moral, and because it's not moral, them, by the fact that they participate in this system, they are becoming morally degraded, and that they are rotting basically spiritually. So in particular, Mr. Auld's wife has never had a slave before. I talked about her a number of times, but she's quite an important character, even though a minor one. So she's never had a slave before. She has no real idea how this institution is supposed to be. And as the years go on, she becomes a worse person for having participated in this horrible institution. So that's something important to look for. I feel like to us, it's like, well, yes, obviously, if you are a racist and you continue to be a racist, you're going to be a worse person afterwards. But really, what he's trying to show is that there are people who consider themselves gentlemen and ladies who are not. And the idea that this institution would hurt their souls was quite something new. A lot of the arguments before that were based in how it was hurting the slaves themselves. And he's trying to say, this is hurting everybody. This is bad for our entire country. It's not just bad for me, the person being enslaved. It's bad for everyone. Now, he's also making that argument to get people on his side, right? And certainly it isn't as bad for the owners as it is for the people enslaved. I'm not saying that at all. But this is a technique that he's using. And then logos, the logic of it, he does talk about as well, to say, logically, this institution does not make sense, and here's why. That might not be there quite as much as the other two, but it is something that I would like you to look for. So look for all three of those pillars of argument: the logic, the ethics and morals, and then also the pathos, the emotion attached to it. One of the final things that I want to say that I don't think I mentioned before is that Douglass is also examining a philosophical question about whether or not people are good. So human nature, is it inherently from birth? Is it selfish and self-seeking? In which case his fear is that the institution of slavery may never go away, or as he seems to kind of posit or claim, that human nature can be better, that people can be altruistic, which means giving or selfless, right? That they can be driven to help their fellow man. And certainly this was kind of in keeping with some of the ideas we talked about with transcendentalism. There are many qualities and really themes throughout this book that are in keeping with transcendentalist thought. I'm not sure whether he was or considered himself an actual transcendentalist. I do know that he considered himself a Christian, but I'm not sure about the transcendentalism. However, the ideas of self-reliance, of reason, of the oversoul, we kind of talked about that a little bit before. That's the idea that there's a vital force in the universe, possibly God, possibly not, depends on which transcendentalist you read, that each soul kind of is connected to. So each individual conscious, the oversoul transcends each individual conscious. Now, for some people, if they were Christians, they would call that the Holy Spirit. For some people who were not and might be more agnostic or of a different faith, they might just call it God, or they might call it the universe, right, in general. So this idea that people have within them the ability to transcend their circumstances. Transcendentalism comes from that oversoul that's above us. It transcends each individual person. So he really does try to connect some of his themes with these beliefs, or at least with this school of thought and these philosophical ideas going in at the time. He had, for obvious reasons, the belief in self-education, the belief in self-reliance, that he is a true intellectual, and that his individuality, his identity is not in his race, and it's not in the circumstances of his birth, but it really is more about who he is as a person. So I just want to read to you, this is from A Transcendentalist Society by Dr. Sandra Thomas. Quote, oh, I'm sorry, the article is by Sandra Thomas. The quote is from Dr. William Andrews. Apologies. So in his introduction to the Frederick Douglass reader, he says, Frederick Douglass's basic idea of his own individuality, his own quintessential identity, lay not in his racial affiliations or his American allegiances, but in his sense of himself as a person with a moral mission. He stood not just for freedom, but for intellectual and moral integrity in the articulation and pursuit of freedom. So those themes are very prominent in this book. The idea of freedom for intellectual and moral freedom, not just physical freedom. All three of those are going to be really intricately connected. You cannot be intellectually and morally free if you are enslaved. You cannot be fully realized as a human being and as an individual if you are in this situation of slavery. It's never going to happen. And so the idea that you are keeping people of color, and particularly the slaves, that you're keeping them in a childlike state, unable to reach their full potential, unable to tap into the flame inside of them that the transcendentalists believed in, and unable to learn and grow and contribute to the good of society if you keep this institution. And that is really his argument. So I hope that this short video kind of explained a few of the things that I'd like you to look for, and I can't wait to see your comments because this isn't that long of a book, but it is an important one. So that's it for today. Thanks, everybody.